I think all sensible people have the British Constitution as one of their hobbies. It is the most interesting matter to discuss and be informed about. As Dicey argued, it is Parliament that is the defender of the liberties of the people, of our ancient Constitution and of our freedoms. I give way. Hello, this is Jacob Rees-Mogg for the final edition of this batch of episodes of Why Parliament Works. In the podcast's first season, I've had the great privilege of speaking to some of the public servants whose behind-the-scenes work is so vital to helping Parliament deliver for voters.
I think I feel extremely privileged to be the first Parliamentary Council and to lead my committed group of drafters who continually go above and beyond.
The role is to make possible, in parliamentary terms, most nearly what the member wants to achieve in political terms.
I've spoken to some of the parliamentarians who do so much to uphold the principles of the Constitution in their day-to-day work.
I mean, I've always been very proud of the way that British politics relies on the fact, is absolutely connected to the fact that we represent our constituents.
There might have been a lot of informal discussion between the minister, along with officials, the Bill team, actually meeting with members to discuss issues.
And of course, I have had the great honour of interviewing none other than Mr. Speaker himself.
All of us have had a different role to play than we expected, and we've all pulled together because we all believe in one thing: that's this House and the future of democracy.
In today's episode, however, I go one step further. You might have noticed the title of the episode suggests I'm interviewing none other than Erskine May himself, which would be something of a turn-up for the podcast given that the first edition of his seminal work, A Treatise upon the Law, Privileges, Proceedings and Usage of Parliament, was published in 1844. Sadly, I was not able to arrange an interview before he died in 1886. However, since then, the work of updating Erskine May's parliamentary practice, as it has since become known, has continued, and I'm delighted to be joined by the latest Commons Clerk to have taken up the mantle. Rather than introducing him myself, I'm going to let Mr. Speaker do that. Here is a clip of him from the chair from October the 1st, 2020.
I want to say a few words about Mark Hutton, who retired from the House of Commons service yesterday. Mark joined the House on this day 35 years ago, and since then many honourable members across the House will have benefited from Mark's wise advice and his authoritative approach to many issues, procedural, practical and political. As Principal Clerk of the Committee Office, Mark pioneered a digital-first approach to publication that led to the process of business change which underpinned that. In recent years, as Clerk of Journals, he has provided me and my predecessor with authoritative advice on matters of privilege. His most lasting monument will be the 24th and 25th editions of Erskine May, for which he successfully as Deputy Editor and Co-Editor. The House is grateful to Mark for all his service and for enabling Erskine May to be available to all members and to the public online.
And on behalf of Her Majesty's Government, may I also convey my gratitude to the 21st century's Erskine May, Mark Hutton, who now joins me. Hello, Mark.
Hello, good morning. Thank you for that very kind introduction.
Well, I often hang on the Speaker's words, but I think he absolutely had the most just on that occasion. But I wonder if we could begin by asking you to explain the significance of this great book to those of our listeners, if there are such people, who haven't read Erskine May from cover to cover.
Certainly. I think the modern significance of Erskine May and its significance has changed, I would argue, over the 160 or so years it's been going. The modern significance is that it has become accepted by parliamentarians, by parliamentary staff and by others as the authoritative description of how Parliament works, particularly how the House of Commons works. At its root, the House of Commons, as I'm sure you will be aware, is not bound by rules so much as by practice. And practice is something a little bit more amorphous than a rule. It is something that depends for its interpretation on how that particular activity has happened in the past. If the the House of Commons had a comprehensive rule book, Erskine May would probably be either a simple academic treatise or entirely unnecessary.
And it evolved because people wanted to know how to get private bills through, didn't it, originally? And that was why Erskine May got it going as a commercial enterprise.
I think that's right, yes. It started as you say, as a commercial enterprise. Erskine May, at the time working in the Library of the House of Commons, probably looking for a way to earn a bit more money, as well as to advance his own profile and reputation, wrote what he described as a manual for anyone interested in the way Parliament operates, public parliamentarians and others. And the feature of it that particularly developed and particularly secured its early commercial success was the private business section, which at the time was very significant and, of course, financially rewarding.
And how long was it before it evolved into being the effective rule book or the codification of the principles of the House of Commons?
I think that's an interesting question, and I'm sure you'll find different views from different people on the correct answer to it. I think it evolved in two phases. I think the first phase takes you up to the end of the 19th century. And if you like, to the first edition, really edited not by Erskine May himself, but by a successor, Palgrave, in which the introduction describes the change in procedure since the first edition as being so significant, with the introduction of all the rules we know about in the late 19th century. And I think at that point, for practitioners, the volume, the treatise had become an important authority. It then has a rather fallow period during the first part of the 20th century, before being revived really by Gilbert Campion, Lord Campion, just after the Second World War, in a new edition. And since then, it has become, I think, more established and more consistently established in the minds of parliamentarians and others as the authoritative text.
So although sometimes people look back to earlier editions and see how practice has developed, actually its really strong reputation and authoritative reputation took a bit of time to develop and has reached its current levels really in living memory.
More or less living memory, I would say. Yes. I mean, I think that's right. Yeah.
And when you were doing the 24th edition, what did you learn about it? What perhaps surprised you most as you were putting it together?
Well, I've of course been involved in three editions, 23rd, 24th and 25th. And they were run quite differently. I think the 23rd under Sir William Mackay was quite a traditional approach to editing the treatise. It was very much his edition. And he was very focused on the sections relating to parliamentary privilege. For the 24th edition under Malcolm Jack, he set up an editorial board, and created the post of deputy editor, which I took on at that stage. So it was I was much more involved in the running of the process of getting the volume prepared, getting it to the publishers, and so forth. I think it was also during that edition that it became increasingly apparent to me and to others that the appetite for access to Erskine May extended beyond, if you like, the precincts of the Houses of Parliament. And we had to start thinking about if we should respond to that interest.
Well, I was going to ask you about that and the digitisation of Erskine May, which has come about with the latest edition, of which you were co-editor. That was quite complicated for copyright reasons, I understand.
It was, yes, the contract that we have had with the publishers, the same publishers for many years, with LexisNexis, Butterworth as were, was a straightforward commercial contract for the publication of a textbook, on the back of the royalties of which the publisher earned some money, and the Erskine May Memorial Trust, which owns the copyright, was established in the 1950s. The trust itself then earns money from the royalties too, from which it is able to afford the work on the next edition. It used to do that by offering effectively honoraria to clerks and others who would participate in preparing the new edition. I have to say the honoraria were pretty modest, and no one did it for the money. It was only very small sums of money were involved, really. But it was a way of ensuring that the work was being done by people more or less in their own time, as a sort of commitment to the broader work on Parliament that being a clerk often involves you in. For the digitisation, and particularly for the public availability, public accessibility to the text, of course, the publishers quite reasonably said, well, we're not going to earn the same level of royalties, so we're not going to give you the same amount of money as the copyright holders. And so we had to change the way in which the 25th edition was prepared by bringing it much more in-house, making it much more something that people could do during their working time, for which they were expected to be able to have time made available, which made it a much larger team than it had been in the past. And it also required us to think through what the editorial and structural changes to the volume would need to be to make it an effective digital publication. And the obvious one there is introducing paragraph numbers.
Yes, indeed, which for those of us who learnt on the earlier editions is quite a change, actually. And it's probably easier to use now online than it is in the physical form.
That may be true, yes. I think I agree with you. I find the paragraph number sometimes slightly counterintuitive to use. And I don't think I'm breaching any confidences when I say that it was a step too far for the editor of the 24th edition, for Malcolm Jack. Which is one reason why that edition, although it was published electronically as an e-book, was never properly a digital publication.
Oh, I see. And so it was the 25th edition, and you were co-editor. Was this the first time there was a co-editor in a formal sense?
No, there had been co-editors in the 1950s. And in fact, Bill Mackay, who edited the 23rd edition, was a co-editor of the 22nd because he was taking over as Clerk of the House, sort of at the time. He was Clerk Assistant. So it has been done in the past.
And so when you and Sir David were discussing the new edition, were there bits of procedure you disagreed with, or was it always relatively straightforward? I can't imagine you had great arguments, but it'd be fascinating to know what sort of things two great brains were wrestling over.
I think there were two different areas where we were wrestling over things. We were wrestling over what was the right emphasis and importance to give to developments which fairly uncontroversially had happened over the previous period. So from 2011 to 2019. And examples of that was how far programming had come on since then, but also the Backbench Business Committee and things like that, some of which sort of feature just as little bits in the 24th, but don't really emerge properly until the 25th. We had some discussions about the relative emphasis be placed on different privilege cases that had come on more recently. But broadly, we didn't disagree with any of that. And we didn't disagree either on the second feature, which was how to draw a deadline for the contents. So at what point do you say, this is the edition up to date X, not past date X? And of course, at the period we were doing this, which was early in 2019, there was, shall we say, a fair degree of procedural fluidity. And trying to draw that line was quite challenging. So you will find that there are references in the 25th edition up to as late as April 2019. But some of the things that happened in the first part of 2019 that you might expect a greater degree of discussion about are not given perhaps the salience that an ordinary reader might expect. And sometimes that was just simply down to not knowing whether they deserved that salience in the broader context of a work that has an endurance over many years.
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? Because the Speaker's precedents are what set out how the House will operate and are the precedent until they're changed. But forthwith usually means forthwith rather than not forthwith.
Yes. And I think that is an example where the reference to that event is very passing indeed in Erskine May. And I for myself, I think if one wished to analyse as a procedural historian, if you like, how that came about and its importance, you couldn't do so without going back and analysing the context, which would involve you in looking at the business motion to which the amendment was tabled and the context of the original business motion and its reuse. So I think if you wish to analyse it procedurally, you'd have to unpack quite a lot around it. If in a work like Erskine May, where you're trying to give a good guide to how procedure operates over the longer term, you can probably say that it cannot be entirely ignored, but it probably isn't going to be an important feature of procedure for the future.
And it is fascinating, the evolution that when we were having lots of procedural wranglings before the 2019 election, I got involved in a discussion on humble addresses and whether or not they fell at prorogation. And I was very pleased with myself because I looked in an early edition of Erskine May and it said they fall at prorogation. And then Farah Bhatti, who I'm sure you know, a very distinguished clerk who was working for the government for a bit, found a slightly later edition that said they didn't fall at prorogation, and from then on there's no reference to it again. So it's fascinating how these evolutions take place. How, when editing it, do you deal with the evolutions and decide, well, yes, this has changed, or actually either the older precedent has been restored or the change hasn't taken place?
That is a matter you have to think about quite seriously. And if I could take an example which I think is less controversial and maybe hasn't been much noticed, the editions of Erskine May up to the 23rd, the first one I was involved in, stated, the immediately preceding edition stated categorically that a select committee that had not been given the powers, the PPR powers for persons, papers and records, could not take evidence even from somebody who was coming voluntarily. Now, I looked back at that in doing the 23rd edition, and the precedents for it seemed, if I may say, less than entirely categorical on one side. So I quietly, with agreement of the editor, dropped that assertion because it didn't seem to me to be quite accurate. And in fact, we then invented the Backbench Business Committee in 2010-11, which was about the time the 24th edition was being prepared. And the Backbench Business Committee, of course, heard representations from backbench members about the business they wanted debated in backbench business debate, but had not been given PPR powers. So that was fortuitous. I didn't look forward and see that. But that is an illustration, I think, of how a statement in earlier editions of May, which had been no doubt considered carefully as select committees slowly developed their roles during the 50s, 60s and 70s, and then sat unattended to for a while, was not really being applied or being thought about as the House developed its procedures on the floor and through procedure committees. I think if I'd not taken that bit out, it would have come out in the 2011 edition as a more sort of substantive change that had to be made, rather than as something that sort of happened almost sub rasa.
It's very interesting because Erskine May to some extent is the Constitution, certainly the legislative part of the Constitution, and it does give the editors an enormous authority, but born out of decades of experience as a clerk and the practice of the Commons, so very much in the tradition of Erskine May himself.
I think that's an interesting point. Bill Mackay, in his introduction to the 23rd edition, does say that in the world of an unwritten constitution, various documents take on a constitutional role, one of which is Erskine May itself. I think that, to be a bit more pedantic, it's the practice of the House of Commons which is an integral part of the Constitution. And Erskine May has become, through a fair amount of work and active engagement over time, has become the most authoritative description of that practice. It doesn't mean it's unchallengeable, but it means that it's the best place to go to try and find out what that practice is in the first place.
Yes, and it's reassuring if it's not easily challengeable from the point of view of a backbench member, because you want to know how the procedures will operate. And it's a defence against arbitrary government, isn't it? That you're there as a backbencher, you're able to ensure that things are done properly, rather than at the whim of a minister or at the whim of any other figure. Yes,
it is, and that is, and it is because so much of that reassurance to the backbencher comes from the solidity of practice that Erskine May becomes important as the expression of that practice.
And it's a much more fluid document than perhaps people think, that I think many people would assume that what Erskine May wrote in 1844, if I've got the date right, which I think I have, had remained. But actually one of the interesting things you highlighted in your words of introduction was that Charles Stewart Parnell had an inadvertent effect on the development of parliamentary practice, which Erskine May then recorded, and all the issues around closure and the developments of timekeeping in the Commons come well after the first edition.
Indeed. I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And people often think that the House of Commons is a fairly unchanging institution, but of course those who work in it and with it know that it's not. It's a never-changing institution. The introduction to the last edition of the 19th century says, and I paraphrase and don't have it in front of me, says basically that when Erskine May wrote his first edition in 1844, the procedure of the House of Commons was pretty similar to that of the Long Parliament in the mid-17th century, and would be unrecognisable to a parliamentarian of 1893, who was, of course, operating in the very different context of all the rule changes that had come in the latter part of the 19th century. And I think, now again, you get a lot of changes in the first part of the 20th century. You possibly get fewer during the interwar years. There's quite a lot of change after the Second World War. Then there's big changes in the 60s with the ending of the Committee of the Whole House on Ways and Means and Supply. So all the way through, there are changes, some of which sit in the mind of people about Parliament as being of real significance, such as the Parnell ones you're talking about, because they're part of our history. Others of which probably no one really recalls, but procedurally may have been just as important.
One thing I want to end on, which is obviously an important part of Erskine May, is setting out the privileges of the House of Commons. How effective do you think these are, and how well recognised?
That's an enormous question, isn't it? I think privilege is one of those things which creates its own aura, and therefore becomes associated with levels of almost totemic importance and complexity, which perhaps it doesn't really deserve. The purpose of privilege is to allow the House, and therefore its members and its officers, to do the job they are being asked to do by the nation, and therefore to provide a degree of protections to them. The ones that we have are derived historically from very different times and very different priorities, and have been, if you like, moulded and sort of contorted into their present shape by a mixture of engagement of the House, often misguided engagement of the House, I would argue, and going back some time, and the operation of the law and therefore of the courts. Since it was established, I think, beyond modern dispute in the first part of the 19th century, that parliamentary privilege is part of the common law. The law of Parliament is part of the common law. The ultimate arbiters are the courts. And so the effect of that, whether the right or wrong of this isn't really relevant, the effect of that is that Parliament can only find out, if you like, what its limits of its privileges are when a court determines it. We can give the best advice we can all the way up to that point, but we cannot guarantee that we are right until we have an authoritative court judgment that relates to the issue that is being considered.
It's probably a subject for another podcast, because I know you have huge experience and insights into how privilege not only works but ought to work in future. But can I just thank you for being on this podcast, but also for a career of the most terrific public service, and ensuring that if people take the time to read it and to understand it, they can know how Parliament works through Erskine May. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye.